Okay, let's get started. Here we are. The truly dedicated are here. So we're doing this, as you'll recall. And we had sort of a preview of what things look like, but now we want to go over and sort of understand why that is. That's the point of today. So we're given this, well, we derived this. And remember, we have these guys. These are the politicians. We're calling them A and B. And they're off from the center. If it was just Downsian model, they would both be at the center line. And so some questions after class last time made it clear that maybe I should go over this a little more. So how you want to look at this in terms of individual policies is you want to look, in terms of policy one, we just want to look horizontally. So even though it's on 2 dimensions, if we wonder how is somebody thinking about policy one, we should look at these guys. And since these guys are symmetric, if I was just deciding based on policy one, everyone to the left of this dotted line would vote for guy A, this top one, right? Because he would be closer to me in policy one. Suppose I'm here, way over here. I would just go to the right on policy one, and the first guy I got to, which would be here, that would be the guy I would vote for. And I would have to go farther on policy one to get to the other guy. Okay. And if I'm just looking at policy two, which of course I'm not, I'm going to put them together, but if I'm just looking at policy two, I would look at it vertically. So if I'm this guy, I would say everyone to the below this dotted line is going to vote for this guy. Everyone above this dotted line is going to vote for that guy. Right, so this guy, he would start walking in this direction down, and he would get to this one first, so he'd vote for that one if it was just policy two. And then he would get to this one, which would be worse. It's a longer distance. It's farther from his ideal policy two. Right, so we just look at it vertically for policy two. We just look at it horizontally for policy one. But of course, they're not looking just in terms of policy one or policy two. They're putting them both together. So for that, what we're doing is we're taking our ruler down to the paper, and we're just seeing which one is closer. Okay? And this line here is where it's equidistant between both of them. And of course, this isn't necessarily a line. If this was 3D, this would be a plane separating the two. Right? So if the policy space is this room, we put a plane through it, and everyone to one side would be closer to guy A, everyone to the other side would be closer to guy B. So everyone above the line, the plane, above this black line is going to vote for this guy, and everyone below is going to vote for that guy. Okay? But what it means is that for this guy, he's above the dotted line, which means in terms of policy two, he likes this guy better. But he's to the right of this line, which means in terms of policy one, he likes this guy better. Right? So he likes this guy better in policy two, but this guy better in policy one. So he has to balance those two things out. And he's below the hyperplane, and so he's going to vote for this guy, holding his nose because he knows that this guy is worse on policy two than the other guy. But he's so much better on policy one that it's worth doing. Are people with me there? Okay. And this is sort of an arbitrary line. We just connected up the dots. But we can think of that as sort of how the politicians think they're competing. They're competing on this line. And we're going to have some things to say about how things end up relative to that line. And sort of the importance of that line is sort of up for you to decide. Okay. Okay, then we had how everybody moved. So these guys in this quadrant think this guy is the best on both policies. On policy one or policy two, everyone in this quadrant thinks that guy A is better. And so they're going to vote for guy A, and he's not going to be perfect for them, right? They're going to have to, he's not the ideal policy, but he's better than the other guy in everything. And so they're not sad that they're not voting for the other guy. They're sad that this guy isn't a better politician. Right? And likewise, everyone in this quadrant here, in the lower right-hand quadrant, is not only going to be voting for guy B, but they're going to think he's better on each and everything than guy A is. And so again, he's not ideal, but he's better than the other guy in everything. So they're not really holding their nose in the same way. But these guys in these quadrants, the other two quadrants, are thinking one guy is better on one thing and the other guy is better on the other thing. Right? So it's not just that he's not perfect, but I'm actually, in some dimensions, I'm voting for somebody who's objectively worse from my point of view. And so then I'm going to have cognitive dissonance. I have to hold in my head. Cognitive dissonance comes from this idea that I have to hold into my head two conflicting ideas, and they're dissonant with each other. They don't sort of match. One is that I'm a good person and I would only vote for a good person. And the other is the fact that I voted for this guy who is horrible on policy 2. And so what I do is I change one of those beliefs. My core beliefs is that I'm a good person. I would only vote for a good person. And so I have to change my beliefs on the other thing, the non-core belief, which is policy 2 in particular, and I would change my beliefs on policy 2. So that's, for example, this guy. This guy prefers guy B because he's so much better in policy 1, but he's worse on policy 2, and so I'm going to update my beliefs on policy 2. So all these guys are going to sort of move downward. These guys are going to move to the left because they disagree with the guy on policy 1, but the other guy is so much better on policy 2, so they're going to change their beliefs on policy 1 over time. These guys are going to move this way. Those guys are going to move that way over time. And what does over time mean? It means when there's something in their life that brings the fact that they're voting for this jerk into their head. So whenever that is. It could be when we vote. It could be when we discuss it with somebody. It could be when we watch a news and it reminds us that we're voting for this guy. Over time, in a vague sort of way, right? How many interactions we have. Right? Okay, so now we're gonna have this thing where it's moving, and we saw it moving and sort of moving towards those two quadrants where the guys were in. But now we want to understand what's going on there. And so there's two sets of graphs that I'm going to give you. I'm going to give you these graphs on the top, and I'm going to give you this graph on the bottom. And I'm going to go through it one at a time. So let's start out with these graphs on the top. Okay? And these, you can't read it from way back there, but this says policy 1, and this says policy 2. So these are looking at it just in terms of one policy, say policy 1, and we're seeing how many people hold each belief. So this is the distribution of people across the policy space from 0 to 1 in policy 1. So their ideal point, the distribution of their ideal point. So if we look in policy 1, we're looking vertically, right? Policy 1 is horizontal. And so if we want all the people at 0, 0, we're just going to add up all those little dots going up to the top, right? And so that's a measure 1 of people that have that ideal place. And that's why we've got this at 1, right? And here, we just sort of count up everybody that has that ideal policy. It's all these guys sort of stacked up this way. It's the same amount of people because we've evenly distributed everyone over this space. So initially, the people the ideal points of people are distributed uniformly. We have a uniform distribution between 0 and 1. It's continuous, but it's a uniform distribution. Everyone's equally likely to have every one of those ideal policies along there. Because we just said that at the beginning. We said everyone's distributed uniformly to start out with. So yeah, that's what we get. Okay. We can do the same thing with policy 2. Okay. Ignore the dark line. Ignore the man behind the curtain for a moment. We'll get to the dark line in just a second. For policy 2, it's the same thing, except now we look horizontally. So how many people have 0.75 for their ideal policy 2? Well, it's everybody along here. So we just add up all those people. That's the same amount as if we added up all those people here. It's 1 in either case, and we get this line going across the top. Okay? So now the question is, what's going on with this bit here and this bit here? So these are going to be the people that have cognitive dissonance, that are going to be changing their beliefs over time, right? That are voting for somebody who they don't agree with on every policy, in the sense that they like the other guy better in some policies. Right, so we're just counting up them, not everybody, but just them. So if we look at, say, what should we do? Let's do policy 2 first. So we're looking at policy 2. And look at 0. Let's start here. So we're looking at this point here, and we're looking for how many people have cognitive dissonance there. Sorry, these are the people who don't have cognitive dissonance. So we're adding up all the people who don't have cognitive dissonance there, sorry. So here, if we can, we've got nobody that has cognitive dissonance there in policy 2. people have cognitive dissonance in policy 1, but they don't have cognitive dissonance in policy 2, right? Is that right? Yeah, that should be right. So these guys, what are these guys? I have to think. These guys, let's look at this red guy here. If I can make this thing work. So he's going to vote for guy 2, right? And guy 2 is worse on policy 1, but good on policy 2. Because if I'm doing policy 2, I just walk straight up here. I move to get to him first. So there's no problem. I like him better on policy 2, but I like him worse on policy 1 because this guy's to the same side of the dotted line as me. Right? So nobody here, this guy does not have cognitive dissonance in policy 2. He has it in policy 1. Right? So if I'm looking along here, there's a bunch of people with cognitive dissonance, all these guys, but not in policy 2. I'm going to die. What is this? Anyway, it's not like, university lecturers are famous for having a clue about what's going on around them. Let's make a pit. Okay. You lose the weak ones. You don't lose. Okay. So there's nobody that has cognitive dissonance in policy 2 along here. So we put the dark line over at 1. Everybody is without cognitive dissonance in policy 2, right? And then as we move along, as we move up, again, still nobody has cognitive dissonance in policy 2. And so we can continue on up, and it's just a flat line. Nobody's got cognitive dissonance in policy 2. But when we get to here, these guys have cognitive dissonance in policy 2, right? So, this guy's going to be moving upward, changing his belief about policy 2. So as we move upward, we have more and more people who have cognitive dissonance in policy 2, and so these guys are the difference. Right? So we're just adding up the people to the right of this line who don't have cognitive dissonance, and all these people do. So the amount that don't have cognitive dissonance starts dropping, and the difference is the people who do have cognitive dissonance. People with me? I know I can be a little confusing. No one's going to admit. Yeah.
And you know that little triangle, so like the one, like
this one.
compares to the like light blue color in the corner.
Light blue color.
Color
This one here. Yeah.
What would then that be?
These are also people who have cognitive dissonance in policy 2, but they're moving the other direction. Right? So how do we tell that? This is the important thing, because you have to be able to figure it out, right? Memorizing it gets you nothing, right? So how do we tell that? Well, this guy is above the dotted line, which means in this vertical policy, policy 2, he prefers this guy, right? But he's to the right of this dotted line, which means in the horizontal policy, policy 1, he prefers this guy, right? But he's voting for this guy. So he's voting for a guy he prefers on policy 1, but doesn't prefer on policy 2. So he's going to change his beliefs on policy 2 over time. So he's got cognitive dissonance in policy 2. Right? And we can see that here, the fact that we have this thing below. So the top is the total number of people, and the bottom one, the darker one, is the people who don't have cognitive dissonance. Well, the fact that there's a difference between them is telling us that there's people in this triangle. So at the beginning, there's lots of them, right? In fact, half the people, right? If we're at 0.5, we've got half the people who don't have cognitive dissonance, so just above 0.5. We have half the people who don't have cognitive dissonance at all, that's these people, and half the people who do, right at just above 0.5. And so that's 50% don't have cognitive dissonance in anything, and then the rest do. But then as we move upward, the amount that have cognitive dissonance starts falling. This horizontal distance is smaller and smaller. And the number of people who don't have cognitive dissonance is getting larger, so the dark line goes up. And then once we get to here, everybody doesn't have cognitive dissonance. Right? And so it goes to 1 here. Okay? So that's the right-hand side. And so the people who are going to be moving are the people who have cognitive dissonance. Right? The people who don't have cognitive dissonance in anything are going to stay exactly where they are. So this dark line is going to stay exactly where it is as time moves on. But the people who do have cognitive dissonance are going to be changing their beliefs. So that's the people who are, between those two lines are going to be changing their beliefs. Now let's do policy 1. Let's see if I can. Let's see if I can do policy 1. So we're doing policy 1, so we're wondering who has cognitive dissonance in policy 1. So Let's start at 0, the same way we did before. Policy 1 at 0, and we go up. And we say, well, who do we have? We have these guys. All of these guys don't have cognitive dissonance in policy 1, but these guys do, right? Let's look at this guy who's in this quadrant. Somebody here, say. He's to the right of this line. So in policy 1, he prefers this guy. He would get to that guy first, moving horizontally. Right? And so he prefers guy A in policy 1, but he's voting for guy B because he's so much better on policy 2. So he has cognitive dissonance in policy 1. So all the people in this area have cognitive dissonance in policy 1, and all the people above this line don't. This guy has cognitive dissonance, but it's in policy 2. Right? And so here at the beginning, at 0, we've got some people, all these guys from here on up to here, don't have any cognitive dissonance. But the rest of the people, the guys from here down to here, do. So there's a gap right here. Right? And the reason they look so different is because we didn't make this symmetric entirely. Right? We just moved them a little bit off sort of the Downsian median voter in policy 1, but we knocked them a lot off in policy 2. And so it's not symmetric. This line isn't 45 degrees. It's some arbitrary amount of degrees, and so the two graphs start looking different. Okay? And then as we move to the right, say to 0.25, the number of people with cognitive dissonance is getting larger, and so this line is falling. The number of people without cognitive dissonance, people above the hyperplane, they're getting smaller, so this goes down. Right? So we have a similar triangle thing. It just doesn't get up to 1 at the end. Okay, so let's go look at we'll ignore this for a minute. We'll come back to that. We're going to look at our movie of what happens over time. Before I was asking you to focus on this, but now I want you to focus a little more on these guys, what's going on here. And so we think these blue line people are going to stay exactly where they are because they don't have cognitive dissonance in that policy. But the guys above that do have cognitive dissonance are going to move towards the center. Okay, so here we go. Here we go? Yeah, here we go. And because we've set it up this way, there's going to be more agreement on each policy. Whereas when you move towards the center, that's some people that are more towards the median voter, there's going to be more sort of societal agreement on policy 1, more societal agreement on policy 2. And you'll notice we get the new distribution, it goes from 1, goes down, and then goes back up. It's got this weird triangle thing. But that's just because there's the number of people who aren't going to move is going down there, right? So nobody was going to move here, and then some people were going to move, so they did, and they ended up in the middle. Right? Okay. Questions about that? Okay, but that's not super interesting. We set up a model where people were, if they didn't agree with everything that their guy was saying, they were going to move towards the center, and indeed, they moved towards the center. We kind of assumed that, right? This is just a graph of what we assumed. It's not really news, right? When we set up what is cognitive dissonance, and we said if you're voting for someone who you like the other guy better in this policy, you're going to move towards the center. And now we have a graph showing that people move towards the center. I mean, yeah, but so what, right? Because we assumed that. So now we want to look at the graph as a whole, and we want to sort of see what's going on as the graph as a whole. And so we're going to do the same thing. And there's like, how do you do that? And we struggled a little bit on how you go about that. And so the way we're going to go about that is we're going to look on the policy line. So instead of looking on terms of policy 1 or policy 2, we're going to do movements along this policy line. So starting from the middle, and then you slowly move out on that policy line. Just to get an idea what's going on. Okay? So let's start in the very center, okay, at 50%. So this is sort of somebody who is the median voter. Let's get our median voter guy, right, or our strong total median, which this actually has a strong total median. So we'll get our guy who's the strong total median, and he's right in the middle. And we're going to say, well, at that point on the policy line, how many people have cognitive dissonance how many people don't. Okay? You'll notice here that the total number of people is more than 1, right? Where before it was always 1 to start out with. So what's with that? It's because we're looking at along the policy line. And so if you think about like the number of people between, like if we're on the policy line right at 0.5, and then we move just a little bit, all the people that we've covered when we did that. And so what I'm doing is I'm moving along, and I'm saying how all the people that are sort of, okay, I know why this is not making sense to me as I'm saying it, because I didn't tell you what on the policy line means. Back up. Okay. So one thing you could be is you could actually be physically on the line. But we're thinking more, let's take this guy, right? Let's take this guy, and we're going to say, where is that guy on the policy line? Well, he's clearly not on the policy line. He thinks that policy line is rubbish and stupid. But if he had to pick a politician, if he could construct a Frankenstein politician, but that politician had to be on the policy line, what politician would he construct in his laboratory? Okay. What would be his ideal point given that he has to be on that policy line? So we're thinking politicians are competing on this line, and where is the closest point on that line to this guy? Well, it's just perpendicular, right? And so his ideal point on the policy line would be here. Okay? If he had to be on the policy line, that would be his ideal politician on that line. Or this guy is clear. His ideal point on the policy line is just right next to him, right? He's not on the policy line himself, but he would prefer a politician on the line here to one here or here or here. Likewise, this guy, given that we're on the policy line, this guy is worse than that guy, but that guy would be worse than somebody here, who would be worse than somebody here. So if we just took a perpendicular distance, let's see if I can write on this. This will be fun. If we took a perpendicular distance for this guy, like that, that would give us his ideal point, would be there on that policy line. Because that's the closest point on that policy line to him. Okay? So given that, so ideally he would like to pick exactly the policies he wants, but given that policies have to be on that policy line for some reason, that would be the point he's at. Okay? So we can think of each person as having their ideal point on this policy line. Right? And then we say, well, who has an ideal point really close to this hyperplane? Right? Well, it's all the people sort of that are really close to the hyperplane. Right? So all of these guys that are just below the hyperplane are going to have ideal points down here. And so if we add them up, well, that's more than 1, right? There's more than if we just went sort of horizontally, which had to measure 1. Here we have a longer line, and so it adds up to more than 1 because it's not flat or vertical, right? The hypotenuse of a triangle is longer than either side, that kind of thing. It's a longer line than this line that we were looking at before. This policy line is longer than that. So we have more people that are really close to that policy line than just 1, measure 1. Okay? That's why it's a bit higher there. And if we look at those people, if we're really close to this policy line, everybody's got cognitive dissonance, right? Because everybody in both of these quadrants has cognitive dissonance in something. So here, instead of looking at who has cognitive dissonance in policy 1, who has cognitive dissonance in policy 2, we're looking at who has cognitive dissonance in anything. And there's nobody that doesn't have cognitive dissonance in anything. Little tiny triangles here, right? But they're basically measure 0. And so all of these guys have cognitive dissonance in something. All of these guys have cognitive dissonance in something. So we get everybody's got cognitive dissonance in something, maybe 1, maybe 2. And there's nobody that doesn't have cognitive dissonance in anything. Okay. Okay. And then as we move along, let's say go down here. We go down here. We go down a little. We'll go down here. Let's go to where this guy is. Right. So now we've moved along the policy line, and we're looking at all the points that have the same slope as that hyperplane. Actually, we're looking at it like a whole plane here, right? And we're looking at how many people are along that plane that's perpendicular to the policy line. So we're looking, if I that's not too bad as my things go, right? This is perpendicular. And we're looking at everybody who's right around that line. Okay, it doesn't look as good on here as it does on my screen. It looks great on my screen. It's awesome. So we're looking at everyone who's like right up against that line, right? Really close to that line. How many people are there? Well, there's still the same number of people total. If I can actually make this go somewhere else. Still the same number of people total because this line is just as long as this one, or this plane is just as long as this one. So we got the same total number of people. Now we want to see how many people have cognitive dissonance and how many people don't. Right, so if we move along here, move along this line, we say, well, these guys have cognitive dissonance. These guys have cognitive dissonance. These guys have cognitive dissonance, just like those guys did in the past. But now these guys don't, right? And then these guys do. Right, so as we move down from here down to here along the policy line, before nobody had cognitive dissonance, and now everybody had cognitive dissonance, and now we got these people who don't. Right? So as we move along, the number of people who don't have cognitive dissonance in anything are going up because we're including more and more of this quadrant. Right? And this is the quadrant where nobody has cognitive dissonance. Okay? And so we can keep doing that. What am I supposed to get out of this? Oh. That's a useless line. Okay. Oh, nice. Okay. Okay. When I get to this red one, right? When I get to this red one, all of a sudden things change, right? Because between the red one, I've moved along the policy line, and as I did it, this area of people with no cognitive dissonance is getting larger and larger, and this area of people here, up here, with people with cognitive dissonance is getting smaller. So we have more and more people with no cognitive dissonance. But then, at this stage, when we get to the red line, which I'm matching up with the red line here, when we get to this red line, then things are changing. As I'm moving farther and farther out, I'm not losing this triangle anymore, right? And I'm just keeping the same number of people without cognitive dissonance. So all of these people, like if we look, I don't know, can we do this? Yeah, if we look, the length of this red line and the length of this green line are exactly the same. We're just shifting them down, right? And so these are the people that don't have cognitive dissonance in anything. So there's the same number of them in this range. And so we get, this gets flat, right? In between the red and the green line, this is flat because we have the same number of people with cognitive dissonance. And we've got the same number of people total because the total line has kept the same length as well along this. But when we get to the green bit and we go past the green bit, then we get fewer and fewer people altogether. Right? Do we have another line? No, we don't. We do not. Okay. So as we go in here, our line is actually getting shorter because we've got a square thing, right? And so if we put a line here, it is shorter than the green line. And so the total number of people is going down. But we're keeping the same number of people with cognitive dissonance all the way until we get to a line that's here. And then we start, without cognitive dissonance, then we start losing people that don't have cognitive dissonance at all. And when we get our line way, way down here, we got nobody. Right? So we get this shape. The people without cognitive dissonance go up as we're including more and more of that triangle, more and more of this quadrant. Then it gets flat as we get into this area between the red and the green lines. And in fact, it gets flat all the way until we get down to here where it's connecting at 0.5, and then it disappears altogether. Okay. So now with that, we know that these guys, the guys above the dark line, are going to be moving, and the guys below the dark line are people who don't have cognitive dissonance at all, and so they're going to be staying put. So this bit is going to be staying put because they don't have cognitive dissonance in anything. These are the people in the quadrants, right? In the quadrants with the politicians, and these guys are going to be moving around. Okay, now we want to watch, we're going to play the same movie again, but now we kind of want to watch this and see how they move around. Okay, here we go. Can we stop this? Okay, I'm going to try to stop it. This is going to be exciting. See if I can. Okay, maybe I can't. There, we'll stop it there. Okay, so this is partway through. And what has happened? Well, here, clearly, things have opened up in the middle, right? And we can see that if I get a pointy stick. People at home are going to have to suffer. We'll have a pointy stick and do it properly here. All right. So what has happened? Let's look at just the guys in the middle, right? The guys that were very close to the separating hyperplane, the guys that were very close to being indifferent, right? So what did they do? Well, a guy that was here has moved to the right, and a guy that is here has moved up. So a guy that is here is someone who has cognitive dissonance in, what, policy 1? And so he is moving to the right. And you can see that with this little pointy bit here on policy 1. Right? That's somebody who's moved to the right. Okay? And somebody here has moved up, and we can see that that's somebody who's moving towards 0.5 in policy 2. This is somebody here who's moved to the right. Okay? So we can see those guys. But what happened to somebody like here, right here? He moved to the right. That's fine. But as he moved to the right, he got farther and farther away from being indifferent. Right? Because he moved to the right because he was voting for guy B, because he liked guy B in policy 2, but he didn't like guy B in policy 1. So now he's changing his beliefs in policy 1 so that he likes guy B even more than he did before. Okay? So it was this guy who was conflicted. The guy who's changing his beliefs is the guy who's conflicted. I got to vote for one of them. One of them is better in one thing. The other one's better in the other thing. Let me go for this guy because I gotta, right? I'm going for guy B. But I was kind of conflicted. I was almost indifferent. But now I'm changing my beliefs in policy 1 so that I like guy B even more. So I'm less indifferent than I was before. So I'm moving away from being indifferent, right? And so on the policy line, I'm moving farther away from the policy line. I used to be here, and now I'm here. Let's take it along these long, I'm at a cross here so we can follow. I'm just moving horizontally. And so before I was really close to the policy line, and now I'm farther and farther and farther away from the policy line. I'm just moving to the right, but it means I'm getting farther and farther away from indifferent because I had these two conflicting things before, but now I'm not really conflicted in policy 1 so much anymore because I've changed my beliefs about it. And so eventually I'm going to get to where my ideal policy 1 is 1/2. And then I wouldn't care between these two guys at all in terms of policy 1, whereas before I did care. Right? So what I end up doing is I'm moving away from indifferent. So these guys who have cognitive dissonance, they're moving towards indifference on each policy, but they're moving away from indifference in terms of the policy competition between the politicians. Along the policy line, they're getting more and more farther apart. They're getting less and less indifferent because it's not just that they're moving towards the middle, it's that the particular people who are moving towards the middle. The people who are moving towards the middle are people who could see it both ways. And now they can't anymore because they moved towards the middle on one thing. And the reason I was voting for guy B in the first place is because I really, really, really like him on something else. Right? And now I don't care about policy 1 anymore. I don't see a difference between them in terms of policy 1 anymore. That something else that I care about becomes more and more important. Right? And so I become less and less indifferent between these guys. I actually saw a couple people nodding. I was like really happy. Okay, all right, can we continue this? Okay, let's play it one more time. And then if we can, probably we can. That's a thing we can do. Okay, so they move away from the center. And you'll notice that as we do this, in the end, there's almost nobody in the center at all. Right? And you can see that, like along the line, how many people are there? Well, almost nobody, just these guys right here at the point. So now we have a polarized society, right? Everyone has sort of they've gathered towards these two quadrants that the politicians are in. Right? This one, they sort of coalesced around, that's the word, coalesced around these two quadrants and moved out of these other quadrants. And so this is, well, what can we say about this? Well, a few things. First of all, we end up with a polarized society, even though if we looked at any individual policy, it looks like we're more in agreement than ever. But overall, people are much more partisan than they were before. Now everyone, before there was a lot of people who were kind of indifferent between the two, but now people really care. Like their politician is their politician, and there's very few people in the middle that are sort of, well, they're kind of close. Very few of those people. More and more people that have extreme views on the politician because they've mitigated their beliefs and the things that they're kind of voting against their interest. The other thing to say is we had this Downsian thing, right? If we think about politicians as competing along this line and just deciding where to go, there were forces drawing them towards the center, and there were these unmodeled forces pulling them apart, right? At the beginning, we said that. Now, the forces pulling them to the center are getting weaker and weaker over time, right? Because at the beginning, there were lots of people that were kind of indifferent. So if I moved this way, I would pick up all those people. If we can we go back? Possibly. So if I'm thinking, if I move a little bit down the policy line, if I move a little bit up as guy B, who am I going to capture? I'm going to capture this whole mass of people. I'm going to move the indifferent guys, and there's going to be a whole lot of people I get because I moved in towards the center. Everybody, right? If I move in towards the center, I'm going to capture all of these guys, measure one of guys, by moving a little into the center, a little more than one actually, because those are guys that are almost indifferent. They just barely like guy A better. If I move a little closer to guy A, those guys are going to start to vote for me, and there's a lot of them. But now, if we can do this, okay. The downside of movies. You can see if I move a little bit towards the center, sure, there's going to be some people who like me better. I'm going to move this line, this separating hyperplane a little bit up, and I'm going to capture some people. But there's very few people there. And so my incentive to move towards the political center as a politician is getting lower because there's just nobody who's almost indifferent for me to pick up. Whereas before there were lots of people who were almost indifferent that I could potentially pick up. So my incentive to move towards the center is getting less. And if we didn't model them, but if there's reasons for me to move away from the center, those are only getting stronger, right? Because we said, what would be a reason to move to the center? Well, maybe I need volunteers, move away from the center. Maybe I need to get volunteers to come out and vote for me, to come out and help me. Well, now, there's lots of these people who feel really strongly. Whereas before, this guy, for example, was way out here who was almost indifferent between the two of us. But now, he's more partisan than he ever was. Right? He moved to the right in this case. Right? So he moved to the right. He's more partisan than he ever was. If I wanted to get him to come out and work for me, I've got to be a little bit more partisan too. Right? There's fewer and fewer people here that I might want to raise money from or might be wanting to get out to vote or anything like that. So there's more incentive to move away than there ever was before. And at the start, we had, like we arbitrarily placed these guys, these politicians. We said, you go here, equal distance from the center. That was arbitrary. But now it's not so arbitrary anymore. Right? If you were a new politician, this guy died, murdered, obviously. So this guy was murdered by my team, and now I get to take his spot. Okay? Is this not Irish politics? Do they not murder each other to take their spot? No, it's more of a slow, like poison that they give them that makes them weaker. Anyway, whatever they do to get rid of their opponents, bad things. We do know they do bad things to get rid of their opponents. They did that, and now I'm stepping into his shoes. Like before we started, any place was kind of equal. But now we have this ideology, right? That you have high policy 1 and low policy 2, or low policy 2, or high policy 2 and low policy 1. Those have become ideologies. That is, there's a large group of people who believes in that kind of thing. There's very few people that have low policy 1 and low policy 2. That's just not a thing that happens in the population anymore. Before it did, but they've all moved out. And there's nobody that has high policy 1 and high policy 2. That is cleared out, right? And so we have these two ideologies now. There's a large mass of people who think that these policies go together in a particular way, even though there's nothing particularly related about these policies, which means as a politician, I can't really go here anymore, right? This would be a dumb thing to do. Before, it was perfectly reasonable because everything was evenly spread. But now, as a politician, I kind of have to go somewhere in this quadrant. Yeah?
Whenever it comes to policy 1 or policy 2, I'll be open to graphs that have a bit of law and they're not identical to each other.
Okay, why are they not? If I put them on a 45-degree line, right? If I moved the amount that were off by policy 1 and the amount that were off by policy 2, the same amount, then it would be identical. But it's because this line isn't 45 degrees, you can see okay, I go do it a little slower. Let me go back, if I can. Is back a thing? Get rid of these guys. Okay. So here, for instance, if we're looking at policy, say, 2, right? If we increase policy 2 enough, we get to a point where nobody has cognitive dissonance in policy 2 at all, right? Because this line, it ends, right? When I'm here, I hit this line, and I get these guys that have cognitive dissonance on policy 2. But at this point, it's hit the wall, right? But if I do the same thing with policy 1, that never happens. That is, I'm moving along policy 1, there's always a group. No matter how extreme I make my policy 1, there's always a group that has cognitive dissonance in policy 1, right? Because we're in a square and we have a non-45-degree line, it hits the walls on one side, it doesn't hit the walls on the other side. Right? So it's not symmetric in that sense, and so it doesn't end up symmetric here. Okay? It could be symmetric, but we'd have to have them the same amount off on both policies. Which gives you some interesting graphs, right? Like, okay, we're going to do this thing again? Yeah, we're doing this thing again. Like this one ends up looking a bit different than this one. This one is flat and then down and then up, and this one doesn't have the flat bit because of where these things hit the wall. Okay. All right. So this is with two policies, and two policies is nice because we can graph it, we can see the whole thing, and we can see how these areas are cleaning out. We can see like this is just like a no man's land where nobody has those beliefs. And then we get this coalescing around the thing. So we can see this graph, and that's nice. But the point of this is not that it's for two policies, it's for any number of policies greater than 1. So we can do any arbitrary number of policies. So let's take a look at it with 8 policies. Okay, so here is n is equal to 8. Now, because n is equal to 8, I can't show you the graph because I don't know how to graph an 8-dimensional thing. I can graph a 2-dimensional thing, but 8 dimensions, I'm stuck. So we only have a representative policy. Here's policy 1. And then we've got the whole policy line. Right? You'll notice that we get a law of large numbers thing going on, which is kind of cool. It starts out normally distributed or close to normally distributed. On any one policy, because there's a whole lot of policies, it is very unlikely that I don't have cognitive dissonance in anything. And it's very unlikely that this particular policy, policy 1, is driving whether or not I'm voting for a guy, right? Because there's 7 other policies. So this policy 1, it's almost, but not quite, unrelated to who I vote for, right? Because it's only 1/8 of who I vote for. And so you can see the people who don't have cognitive dissonance in policy 1 are almost half the people. A little more, if I have a very extreme view on policy 1, it's likely that I'm going to be voting for that guy. Okay? Not super likely because there's 7 more policies. But if I have a middle of the road policy 1, then it's exactly 50% that I vote for the guys. So there's a little bit of increase towards the edges, but very little. Also, you can see people who have cognitive dissonance in nothing are really, really small, right? Because you can think there's, in the 2-dimensional case, there were 2 quadrants that included the politicians, and there were 4 quadrants altogether. So there was a 50% chance that I had no cognitive dissonance in anything. But here, there's still only 2 quadrants that have the politicians in them. Those are the quadrants where people won't have cognitive dissonance. but there's 2 to the 8th total quadrants. If you think about a cube, it's got, what, 8, but 2 to the 3rd, it's got 8 quadrants, right? And with 8 policy dimensions, there's 256 quadrants. So the chance of having no cognitive dissonance, of picking a random guy who has no cognitive dissonance, is 1 in 256. And so the guys that have no cognitive dissonance, really small. They're here in the graph. Okay, here we go. All right, so here's the thing happening over time. People without cognitive dissonance move to the center, and everyone's moving away from indifferent, and it ends up looking like this, which is like 2 normal distributions on either side of the policy line. Right? And the normal distribution is just coming about because of the usual law of large numbers, which is gorgeous. Right? When you add up lots of little things, it ends up normal. And now we've got 8 little things that we're adding up, and so it comes out, even with only 8, it comes out pretty close to normal. Right? Not exactly normal, but close. Okay, so how are we doing? We got 5 minutes. Okay. And this is just what we were saying. We have, so the last thing I want to do here is I want to talk a little bit about how this stuff gets proven. And I'm not going to obviously lead you through the proof, but just to give you an idea how it works. Okay? So with cognitive dissonance, each voter moves away from the center of the axis of political competition. That's the thinning out of the center, right? Yeah, that's fun. So how does this work? How do we prove something like that? You can see it on the graph. I can do simulations, but that doesn't prove anything. So how do you go about proving it? Okay. So the first thing notice is that we have this separating hyperplane where the people are indifferent, right? And then this policy line is perpendicular to that, orthogonal technically, because in n dimensions, perpendicular is a bit hard to define, but orthogonal to that policy line. It's perpendicular to it. Okay. Then, what we're really interested in is if you're moving farther from the policy line, we're wondering what is the closest distance to that line from where you are. And we want to show that that closest distance is increasing. And so the closest distance is also going to be perpendicular to the policy line. Right? And we showed that before. We were saying the closest point to your policy line is going to be perpendicular to that policy line. And it's going to be perpendicular to the hyperplane. So all we need to show is that the place where you're at is getting farther from the hyperplane, right, to show where you are on the policy line. So we just need to show that you're going farther from this hyperplane, where people are indifferent. And so here, I've got a hyperplane. I know 3D and all that, but this is the separating hyperplane. This is saying all the people on this are indifferent. People to this side are voting for, say, guy A. Okay? And here I am at my original position, x1. And then there's going to be an election, and I'm going to move to my new position, x2. And I just want to show that when I move from my old position to my new position, I am now farther away from indifferent than I was before. So I'm moving away from the political center. Okay? This is what I'm trying to show. And so that's just need to show that v is smaller than w. The length of this vector is smaller than the length of that vector. And the cool thing is, and why I show you this, is that we have this n-dimensional thing. We're doing this in 8 dimensions. I draw this as a plane just because I can, but in fact it might be a 7-dimensional object, right? It could be a mess, right? But by doing this, by putting it in this form, we've turned it into a 2-dimensional problem where all your normal trigonometry works. All the stuff you have in high school works now because what we've done is we have this thing, this line, which is just a line, which is perpendicular to this one. And we know that they're perpendicular here, so this is like a right thing. And so then we have a 2-dimensional thing. We've just defined this sort of new plane here between these things. And this is actually a plane. This is a 2-dimensional thing that we can actually work with. We can use sines and cosines and tangents and all that stuff. All the geometry we normally have. We started out with 8 dimensions, but by looking at these perpendicular things, we've turned it into really just a 2-dimensional problem. And so this is something that all of you can handle. You'd have to like sit down and sort it out, but it's something that you've seen in high school once we convert it to this. Okay. I'll let you go, and we'll finish this up next time.